if you want to. So let's talk about how to build a house that collapses. That's the question we're going to answer today. We'll be looking in Luke 46, 46 through 49. And so before I do get started, I want to show you some pictures of some people that it looks like they were trying to build a collapsing house. Here's number one. Okay. I mean, I don't know if they were trying to make it collapse, but I don't know if they were looking for flying cars or what was happening, but it makes you worry about that house. Okay, here's the next one. Okay. Oh, so how do you get out? How do you shut the door once you get in that thing? Whew. That's a house you don't want to go into, probably. All right, what's the next one? Okay, that could be shocking. All right, what's the next one? There, you got two more. Oh, now that. How does that work? Okay. I wouldn't go in there. One more. That's trouble. So, if you got a 16-year-old driver like we have coming up, that could be trouble right there. So, anyway, so it looks like they're on their way to building a collapsing house. Well, let's look in God's Word. And we're talking about following Jesus. And Jesus tells us in this parable, he's going to say there's two kinds of houses. There's two kinds of houses. There's houses that fail when storms and when winds comes, they collapse. And a house that's well built, that cannot be shaken. So let's just read the verse together. I think it's going to be up here as well. It says this: "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house, who dug down deep and laid its foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it, because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete." And so, here we see Jesus is telling his followers, he's talking to his followers, and he says there's two houses. One built on a rock, one built on sand without a foundation. And I think what he's saying is that there's two approaches. There's two ways to follow God. And you need to be able to tell them apart. It's important that you can discern one from the other, because one leads to destruction when storms come, when the floods come, and the other withstands the floods of life. And so as you look at this and you think, what's interesting about these two houses, these two ways, is from the outside it's hard to tell one from the other. The houses look exactly alike just from the visible, from the outside. And so what that must mean is that Jesus isn't talking about like good people and bad people. But what he's contrasting here is two kinds of people in the church. Two kinds of followers, just the religious and the true disciples. And it's important because the difference can be hard to tell from the outside. But it's what's underneath. It's the foundation that makes the difference. And so Jesus is saying that these two kinds of followers, if you look there, he says they're doing the similar kinds of things. They're both saying to him, Lord, Lord. They both call him Lord. They both hear his words. They both listen to his words. But there's a big difference between the two. And the difference is obedience. It's obedience. It's when you hear the word of God, do you put it in practice or not? And it makes all the difference when life's floods come. And so I think what's happening here is Jesus has given us this warning, that us in the church, he's given us this warning, kind of this check yourself parable. Because I think it's easy for us to deceive ourselves and to think we're in good shape, we're going to church, we're good. When actually, when the storms come, it may destroy us. And so Jesus says, look, here's how you build a collapsing house. First, First, when you hear my words, put conditions on your obedience. Put conditions on your obedience. Only obey when you understand why I tell you to do something. Only obey if it will pay off for you. This is really partial obedience, selfish obedience. If you don't understand it, or you don't know how it could be good for you, then don't do it. Build your house on the sand, and it will fail. See if you say, well, I trust the Bible, but I don't like this part, and I don't want to do that part. You're not actually following Jesus. You're just kind of picking and choosing. You're still basically deciding how things will go. When you read God's Word and you say, well, how can I make this mean something different than it sounds like? You're changing His words. And so you're the one deciding what's right and what's wrong. And you're not the disciple. Really, you're just religious. You're just making up what you want to do. See, if you only obey when you understand why, if you only obey when you see that it's going to pay off for you, you can understand how it's going to pay off. If it only obey when it makes sense to you, if you only obey when it looks like this is going to be good for me, then the truth is you're not obeying at all. It's not obedience. Really, what you're doing is you're just actually agreeing with God in some parts, and in some parts you're not. There's a great example of this in the Old Testament. There's a story of, it's in 1 Samuel, it's the story of King Saul. And King Saul was the king of God's people. And God goes to King Saul. And he goes and he tells him, he says, I'm going to punish the Amalekites, these guys, because what they did to Israel, for they waylaid them as they came up from Egypt. And so he tells Saul, what I want you to do is go and attack the Amalekites. And I want you just to totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. And Saul thought, well, that doesn't make much sense. Like, why not bring some of this plunder home? There's going to be lots of good stuff, livestock that will feed our people. I'll bring it back. I can bring the king back and show everybody what a great king I am, how I did. And so that's what Saul did. And so a lot of obedience doesn't make sense to us. And so Saul chose to keep the Amalekite king alive, and he took the plunder from the battle rather than destroy everything as God had commanded him. And so God came to him, Samuel came to him, the prophet for God, and he said to Saul, he said, Saul, why did you not obey the Lord? Why did you not obey the Lord? And it's really interesting. Listen to what Saul says. But I did obey the Lord. I went on a mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites, and I brought back King Agag their king. The soldiers took the sheep and cattle from the plunder. But listen to this. The best of what was devoted to God in order to sacrifice them to God. I think what you see here is that it can be real easy to deceive yourself and to think that your partial obedience is obeying. God says it's not. It's building a house on sand. And then Saul, he tries to cover it up. He tries to earn God's approval by offering a sacrifice. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But when he does, here's God's response to that. God says, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? That to obey is better than sacrifice. And here we see God says, I don't care about your righteous religious acts that you're doing if you're not going to obey me. If you're not going to put my words into practice. See, by just doing part of the way, just doing a little, just doing with conditions, you're not really obeying at all. And so if there's a conditions to your obedience, if there's limits, it's not obedience. I was thinking about this week, and I feel like I see this more and more today. I see this more and more in churches too, that they don't like what God's Word says. Either they don't understand why He would say that, it doesn't seem practical to them. And they think now we've got really a better understanding. We've evolved. We can understand right and wrong more than what God's Word says. And there's a Bible commentator, Matthew Bruner, and he had this great quote. He said, "It's not enough to be Christ-centered. It's not enough to ask of our leaders of the church to be Christ-centered. We must also ask, do they seek to keep, and do they encourage others to keep the commands of Jesus? It's not enough to ask, do they win others to Christ, but we must ask, do they seek to do and move others to do the will of God?" See, it's possible to work for Jesus. It's possible to offer sacrifices and yet not live under Him, not obey Him. It's possible to be religious and not be a disciple. So the question for you today is, what do you do with the commands of God? What do you do with the commands that seem impractical, that don't make sense to you? Do you obey those? Do you obey those? I was just listening to a podcast during the week, and it was these two Christians, and they were talking about the purity movement in Christianity about 15 years ago, True Love Waits, and they were discussing the good and the bad of that movement, and it was really interesting. But as these two Christians were talking, one of them said this. They said, "We need a new ethic for sex." See, the idea of sex being for marriage only, well, that worked for me when I was in high school, but it doesn't work for me now, a 30-year-old single person. I need something more practical for me. And it's so interesting because this was a Bible-believing, Christ-centered follower at everything else she said. But here she was saying, I don't understand it. I don't understand what God's saying. It doesn't really pay off for me. It doesn't make sense, and so I'm not going to follow it. I need something new. I need something different. But Jesus says, no, you need to obey. He says, obey even when you don't understand. To obey in all areas of your life. There's an old booklet that's called My Heart, Christ's Home, that was real popular, and I think we would all, as followers, want to say, My Heart, Christ's Home. But if you let Jesus into your house, and you say, Lord, this is your house, but this room over here you can't go in. This is an area that's kind of off limits for you. See, if it's His house, but you're telling Him where He can go and where He can't, then it's not really His house. It's your house, and you have conditions. So if you can say, Lord, I will obey here because it makes sense, but not here because I'd just be so unhappy. I just don't understand it. Then you're not obeying at all. You're not a true disciple. God is not your master. He's your consultant, basically. But if you're trying to build a collapsing house, you're in good shape. You're in good shape. That's how to build a collapsing house. Look, Jesus was talking this passage, and a little earlier, he said this. He was talking to him, and he gives these commands. He says, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. Give to everyone who asks. And if anyone who takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. And as you look at that, partial obedience doesn't work there. Partial obedience, you can't just do that part way. It doesn't, you can't figure out how that's always going to make sense to love somebody that's mean to you, that your enemies that want to harm you, and you're going to give to them. How can it be good for you? So the first rule of building a collapsing house is place conditions on your obedience. Only obey when you understand why. Only obey when it makes sense, when it will pay off for you. That's rule number one. Second rule, Rule number 2 to building a collapsing house is seek approval by your works. Seek approval by your works. I call this religious obedience because it operates out of the principle of this. I obey God, therefore I'm accepted by God, and now God owes me. See, that's how Saul tried to cover up his partial obedience. He said, let me offer a sacrifice to God, and then I'll be okay. Then I'll earn his approval. And what we see here is that underneath there's 2 motivations to obey God. The first one is that so that you'll be accepted and loved. But the second one is because you have already been completely accepted and loved. And it can be hard to tell the difference from the outside. The houses look the same, but there's a completely different foundation. I think there's a perfect example of this in Matthew 6. When you look at Matthew 6, I think it's the same context as the Luke passage that we're looking at. And Jesus has 3 things that he commands and tells us to do. Their fasting, their prayer, and giving to those in need. But he says there's a way to do these commands, but you're not really obeying. You're not really obeying. What you're doing is you're doing it for yourself. You're doing it for a blessing. You're doing it, it's not real obedience. It's the motivation that makes the difference. So look at the motivation as we look at these. He says this, he says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. Verse 5, a little further, he says, and when you pray, which is a good thing, pray, but do not pray like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. And then verse 16, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. And so here you see, what's the reason this religious person follows these commands? What's the reason they give to the poor, that they pray, that they fast? They're following God's commands, but why? Do they give to the poor for the poor? No. I mean, here you can see it's to earn approval. It's to earn the approval of others. It's to earn the approval of God so that God will have to give them a good life. So that God will have to answer their prayers. So that people around them will have to give them honor. So that you can say and have other people say to you, God say, oh, it's a good person. Look at what a good person. His face is so disfigured from fasting. He must be a good person, right? And what's happened is we're trying to work from the outside in. We're trying to fill up what we want on the inside. And so that's what religious obedience always does. It starts from the outside in. You say, if I do all these things, then maybe I'll be able to fill up what I'm missing inside. Maybe then I'll be able to prove I'm valuable. If I go to church, if I could read my Bible, if I give my things away to the poor, you know what you're doing? You're just working from the outside in. See, maybe then God will bless me. Maybe then I'll feel decent about myself and get the life I deserve. The problem is it doesn't work. It's really burdensome. It's really tiresome. And you know what you're really doing? You're really looking at yourself as the basis for your relationship with God. So religious obedience is almost like we feel like if we just work hard enough, if we really try, that somehow that will atone for our sins and that will make us right with God. And so our only hope is just to be good enough for God. And then He would bless us. We say, God, look what I'm doing for you. Look at all that I'm doing for you. And I think, as we think about this, that most of us have been in the church long enough. We know this isn't right. But what I think is that we still live this way a lot of times. You know, we know it in our head, but practically it hasn't made it out to our heart. So there's a kind of a test. Martin Luther had this test for the way to know whether your obedience is religious. He said, when life seems hopeless, what do you look for your vindication? Or to say it another way, what do you look for to know you're somebody? When the chips are down, when things don't go your way, what do you say to yourself? Do you say, well, I'm a good parent. I'm a really good parent, it's okay. Or do you say, well, I'm a really moral person. I'm a spiritual person. I'm involved in church. Or do you say, I made it in this world. I'm a lawyer. I'm a doctor. I've made it to the top of the firm. What do you say to yourself? How do you defend yourself? That's your foundation. That's what you're building your house on. Your obedience to earn approval is not the obedience of a disciple. It's how to build a house that collapses. When storms come, when trials come your way. And so we see that there's two ways to build a collapsing house. Right? Place conditions on your obedience, just partial obedience, or obey to earn approval from God and for others. And so I want to show you what this looks like. I found this clip, and I think it's exactly what Jesus was talking about, of a house swept away in the flood. Wow, that's powerful. So maybe you looked at that and you thought, okay, maybe building a collapsing house isn't the way to go. Maybe that isn't the way to go. Maybe building a life on a foundation that won't make it when times are tough, when life seems to beat you up, that you just crumple. Maybe that's not the way to go. And so if that's the case, let's look at one other way to build a house. To build a well-built house, to build a house that won't be shaken when the flood comes, when the torrents come. Jesus said this. This is what he said. This was his words. He said, this is how. Come to me, hear my words, and put them in practice. I call this relational obedience as we're thinking about this. Relational obedience. So for our modern culture, the idea of obeying someone's rules and commands and having a kind of a close, intimate relationship with them seems really contradictory, right? Well, if they're going to tell me what to do, I mean, we get riled up just thinking about if we have our spouse or our true love is going to order us around, commanding us what to do. It seems like that would quickly end a relationship, right? But I don't think those ideas are quite so contradictory. I think there's a way to see obedience and relationship together that maybe you haven't considered. So let me show you this way. If you're truly falling in love with somebody, if you're truly falling in love, real love, and you want a close relationship with that person, what do you do? What do you do? Think back, maybe on your first love, your spouse. You do your research. You find out what they like. You find out what they don't like. You find out the things that offend them, right? You find out what offends them, what gets on their nerves, what makes them mad. And if you love them, you try to avoid them. I mean, does a relationship ever work when one person basically says, I don't really care what you like, what you don't like. I'm just going to do whatever I want. I mean, no. Relationships never work if you're just constantly offending them and you don't care. And so you not only want to know what will offend them, what gets on their nerves, but you also want to know what makes them happy, what they delight in, even the little things that make them happy. Just the little things. And so what are you doing? Well, you begin to do the will of your true love. It's what your true love wants in his or her life. And what you're doing is you're actually obeying the will of your true love. And without even being asked, you begin to conform your life to their will. You begin to obey them. It's obedience, but it doesn't even feel like obedience. See, when you fall in love with somebody, you put your happiness into their happiness. And so you're only happy when they're happy. You can't help it. And that's the way love works. And so the reason that you fulfill their will is just to see them smile. Just to make them happy. Just to see the joy in their eyes. You obey them. That's what relational obedience is. That's the kind of obedience that God desires. Obedience from a heart that loves him because he loves us first. Obedience that flows out of love because Jesus gave his life for you. And you know it, that he died on the cross to save you. And you just want to love him. You just want to love him back. But to be honest, when we think about that and talk about that, there's going to be times, like in any relationship, where it's going to be hard. Where relationships are going to be hard, that it won't be easy. Relationships always are. They always take work, and there'll be times in your relationship, there'll be seasons in your relationship with Jesus where it will be difficult. I think that's why in the parable, Jesus said that the man dug down deep and laid his foundation on the rock. I think there's times where it will feel like work, where we will have to dig down deep. But that's when we must remember God's love for us. We must remember the love that he's already shown us on the cross. And if you're here this morning and you think, well, that's what I want. I mean, that's what I want. I want to obey. I want to love Jesus so much that placing my happiness in his is natural, that following his will is a joy. But I'm not there. I disobey. At times I place conditions on my obedience. I do try to earn God's love at times. Sometimes I just disobey just because I want to, right? But I hate it. I want to obey. Well, if that's the place you're in, Peter was in that same place. God's disciple. You remember in the gospel story, Jesus' disciple, Peter? Peter had disobeyed God. He had denied God. He had denied Jesus. Remember, 3 times. It was just before Jesus' crucifixion. And Jesus looked at Peter. And when Jesus looked at Peter, that's when he realized what he had done. He had done wrong. And he goes out and he weeps bitterly. He wanted to obey, but he didn't. He had messed up. And there's a hymn that John Newton wrote. John Newton's the one who wrote Amazing Grace. He wrote a hymn called The Look. And the lyrics of this hymn, I think, capture exactly how God changes our hearts to love and obey him in a true love relationship. It's when we see deeper and deeper his love for us, that he loves us, that he loves you. Let me read these lyrics to you. It says, "In evil long I took delight, unawed by shame or fear, till a new object struck my sight and stopped my wild career. I saw one hanging on a tree in agonies and blood, who fixed his languid eyes on me as near his cross I stood. Sure, never till my latest breath can I forget that look. It seemed to charge me with his death, though not a word he spoke. My conscience felt and owned the guilt, and plunged me in despair. I saw my sins his blood had spilt, and helped to nail him there. Alas, I knew not what I did, but now my tears are vain. Where shall my trembling soul be hid? For I, the Lord, have slain." But then he has a second verse. And this is what he says in the second verse. "A second look he gave which said, I freely I'll forgive. This blood is for your ransom paid. I die that thou mayest live. Thus whilst death my sin displays in all its blackest hue, such is the mystery of grace, it seals my pardon too. With pleasing grief and mournful joy, my spirit now is filled, that I should such a life destroy. yet live by him I killed. I think Peter looked at Jesus. He looked at Jesus and he saw the love and the grace that Jesus poured out on him on the cross. And it was because of his disobedience that Christ was on that cross. See, Jesus obeyed the will of the Father perfectly. He obeyed perfectly, but on the cross, he was destroyed. You might say that his house collapsed, that he was swept away with the torrent, and it was not because he was disobedient. It was because we are. It was because we are. He took our place. He paid our price so that we won't have to. He died the death we deserve so that we might live. And he freely forgives all those who trust in him. So until you see Jesus doing that for you, you'll never be able to obey. Your obedience will always be incomplete. It will always be to try to earn his love. But the more you see God's love, the more you see his grace for you, the more you will fall in love with him. And his Spirit changes your heart to love him so that your joy is tied up in his joy. And you delight in what delights him. And so you obey just from a heart that loves him. It just loves him in return. Let me close in prayer.